Merry Christmas, everyone, and I got a hell of a story for you. This might not be a traditional Christmas story. In fact, I'm pretty much going by Die Hard rules here, where it, might not really involve Christmas, but it takes place on Christmas. Now, this story, I kind of prelude in my last video.
More like a year ago.
And what was that story? Well, it was Batman the Shadow, the Murder Genesis.
Last year, I reviewed the comic A Very DC Rebirth Holiday Special, a trade that was a collection of 3 holidays-themed comics, with 2 of the comics being anthologies, and for 2 of the stories, I didn't really get into them. The first being Silent Night, since it was a pretty short and sweet story compared to the others, and the second being The Stag, because that story pretty much set up the tone of this crossover.
Some of you who are new to comics might be asking who the Shadow is.
The Shadow was created in the 1930s by Walter B. Gibson for the radio show called The Detective Mystery Hour. Originally, the Shadow was simply meant to be the mysterious narrator and not really interact with the other characters or interfere with the story. But because of his popularity, he would end up getting picked up by Street and Smith publications and become the star of a pulp magazine.
As for the history of pulp magazines and comics, well, I have a link in the description down below to my Spider review where I talk about that.
As for who the Shadow is, well, there are multiple versions of the famous pulp hero, with some of his earliest identities being Kent Allard, a World War I fighter pilot who faked his death after the war and began waging a new war on the criminal underworld. He goes under several other aliases to go undercover and get information they can use to take out his enemies. One of those aliases being an already existing character, a wealthy playboy by the name of Lamont Cranston.
Which of course leads to the Shadow threatening Cranston with death. Yeah, he is not a nice guy.
The radio show, along with later incarnations, would drop the duo and instead just have them be one and the same, with Lamont Cranston becoming the Shadow, but still keeping the multiple aliases and even keeping Ken Allard as one of them. Hell, depending on which version you're reading, they'll switch around on which one is the alias and which one is the real name. As for the Shadow's skills and abilities, that's also changed throughout the years. Originally, Kent, or in some cases Lamont, traveled to East Asia and would learn to cloud men's minds, which was a fancy way of saying he mastered hypnotism, though this would evolve into him having a more supernatural connection, with the city he had his training being a place known as Shambhala, as a sacred place akin to the legend of Shangri-La, and even imply the Shadow could be more than human.
And this would also kind of shift around throughout the stories. Sometimes it was truly supernatural, and others it was just a way to, spook the enemy.
The show would also jump around several comic companies, with the most prominent being Dark Horse, Marvel, DC, and recently Dynamite. Though while under DC, we would get 2 crossovers with Batman, and even imply that Batman was inspired by him as a kid.
Which was a way to, reference the fact that the Shadow was one of the big influences for Batman, along with Zorro.
So as you can see, the Shadow has had a very long and interesting history. Whether he's Kent Allard or Lamont Cranston, a simple hypnotist, or an actual supernatural force, or fighting in the 1950s, or in the modern day, the Shadow will always know the evil that lurks in the hearts of men.
Now, the history lesson done, let's talk about the comic.
Warning, spoilers. We open on Christmas Eve, where Batman faces off against the ice-themed villain, Mr. Blizzard.
Which I gotta say, I always like to see a lesser-known character get some spotlight.
Batman is able to defeat the villain and save his target, a Mr. Barry O'Neill, a man who was hosting an annual holiday event in Gotham City, and later learned Bruce's mom saw as a personal hero. And just from the opening, we kind of see why, with him immediately taking responsibility, since he was getting threats by Blizzard and regrets not taking them seriously, since people could have died. Gordon tells him not to beat himself up and assures him that he still did good, and despite how it ended, people still had a good time. Afterward, Bruce is talking to kind of Robin, but not officially, Duke Thomas, and despite saving O'Neill, he can't help but feel like he's not doing enough sometimes, since the unfortunate truth is, no matter who we are or what we do, death will always come for us. This truth speaks louder as O'Neill comes home, only to be visited by an uninvited guest. That intruder would proceed to kill O'Neill by stabbing him in the head. This intruder, the Stag, would only tell him that he is an honest signal as the prologue ends.
Existential crisis, bloody murder. Merry Christmas, everyone.
We follow up in the French Alps, where Bruce comes face to face with one of his old mentors, Henry Ducard, telling his old mentor that he must help him because there is a mystery he cannot solve on his own. We flash back to Gotham 1 week ago, where we go to a familiar house on this familiar Earth, Arkham Asylum, where surprisingly things are pretty relaxed. We meet probably the only employee in Arkham that everyone seems to like. This guy is giving everyone a good meal customly made for them that he personally took the time to either prepare, or in the case of Two-Face, who just wanted a ballpark Frank, get for them. This guy's so nice he even takes care of a rescue dog.
This truly shows that even in a place like Arkham, there is always a spark of kindness in the darkest of places. Now on to his bloody murder.
Yep, the Stag strikes again, killing the poor man while Batman investigates his murder. We learn the man's name, Lamont Cranston. Before we can get answers though, Batman is attacked by someone in the room. The two fight leads to the outside and comes face to face with the Shadow, and reveals he doesn't just know who Batman is, but in fact knew Patrick Wayne, Bruce's grandfather. Sometime later, Bruce would continue his investigation and learn something unusual. That being that Lamont Cranston is already dead. In fact, he's been dead for decades, apparently since 1963. And not just that, but it seems that the Shadow that he encountered was Cranston. Batman begins tracking him down, meeting up with people who knew Cranston, even coming to the grave of Kent Allard, who also seemed to die the same time as Cranston. Eventually, Batman would meet with the last of the Shadow's allies, Margot Lane. She tells Batman that the Shadow's been fighting crime since the 30s, much like in the original stories. But as everyone else got older, he stayed young. Margot believed that his hatred of evil retained his youth, but the more he fought, the more detached he became with others, to the point he told them to start referring to him as Master. The trail would end with Batman under the alias of Matches Malone finding his last known location and seeing that the Shadow truly wears many faces. And as we return to the present, we see that one of those faces are Bruce's old mentor, Henry Deckard, leading to the question of who is the Stag? What is their plan? What will happen when the Joker gets involved? Who is truly the Shadow? What exactly is his connection to Batman? And do I even have to say you're gonna have to read the story to find out? Probably not, but I'm gonna say it anyway. You're gonna have to read the story to find out. This book is probably one of my favorite crossovers. It's a perfect blend of classic pulp comics with a tone of the modern Batman that goes between the transition of the New 52 line to Rebirth, which makes sense since one of the writers was Scott Snyder, who was just getting off the main Batman run that started from the beginning of the New 52 to the very end, and with him co-writing the prelude to the Rebirth line with then head writer Tom King. The other writer is Steve Orlando, who is no slouch when it comes to making works of art. He even won an Eisner Award for his time on the series Outlaw Territory for Image. Orlando also scripted the book. I can definitely tell that this is a blend of both the writer styles, especially when it comes to Snyder's take on architecture. It is also a great jumping on point for people who might want to get into the Shadow. Snyder and Orlando do a great job explaining the lore, without it feeling like it's stealing focus or having the story lose momentum. Next up, let's talk about the characters, starting with our stars, Batman and the Shadow. This is a pretty interesting dynamic where Batman is more of a rookie while the Shadow is more of the professional, but also a bit of a cautionary tale for the Dark Knight. The Shadow's war on evil is not too different from Batman's war on crime, but while Batman still values human life and still has lines he won't cross, the Shadow simply doesn't. He will kill and cross all the lines as long as it means evil is done. By this point, he no longer sees a reason to acknowledge his humanity. The two both complement each other while at the same time challenge each other, leading to an internal fight, but unlike some crossovers that would have the heroes fight, doesn't seem unrealistic or time-consuming. As for the evil they face, let's talk about the Stag. Without spoiling too much on who or what the Stag is, I'll just start by saying this villain is creepy as hell, from the way they speak, to the creepy porcelain doll-like face, to the constant feeling of dread. They come off less of supervillains from the pulp era and more like a slasher villain, yet they still work perfectly. They don't feel out of place with the rest of the story's tone. It's kind of a shame they never made any form of comeback after this. Sure, given how it ends, it would be difficult, but not impossible. Next, we have the Stag's partner in crime, and kind of the villain they usually show up in most crossovers, regardless of the circumstances, the Joker. Joker being in the story was kind of expected. As I mentioned, most Batman crossovers usually try to have at least one scene with him, regardless if it makes sense or not. And luckily for us, this isn't one of those times. Not spoiling anything major regarding the Stag's plan, it's established for the plan to work, they need assistance of someone just as evil. And Joker kind of fits the bill. As for his personality, this is where I could tell Snyder was definitely, working on this part, since how he writes the Clown Prince of Crime is also pretty much like a horror movie. Don't believe me? Go check out Death of a Family or Endgame. Things get pretty disturbing disturbing. Anyway, he is right with the Stag, and it's a good counter to Batman in the Shadow's unstable team-up, while Joker and the Stag are pretty in sync for most of it. Finally, we gotta talk about the supporting characters like Alfred, Margot, and fellow supporting Batman character, though for some reason is MIA in all the films, Leslie Tompkins. Despite having less focus than both the main protagonist and the antagonist, they all have moments to shine, like Margot calling out the Shadow on his obsession with his war, and how it's pretty much worn all of his allies down, and how it's kind of messed up that the cycle might begin again with Batman with him, or Leslie's confrontation with the Stag after they targeted her for being a possible victim, or even Alfred, who actually shares a pretty insane story of a mission back when he served under MI6. Of course, there's also inmates of Arkham, who though get even less focus, still get moments to shine, and a pretty awesome action scene. Yeah, it's odd Duke just kind of shows up in the beginning and then disappears after that. It just felt really random just to have him show up. Maybe originally, back when they were working on this for the Rebirth Holiday Special, they had more plans for Duke to be a bigger character, but couldn't find a way to have him fit in the story. I mean, it's also very likely that he was just there for the Christmas part, but either way, I do wish his character got some play here. But luckily, his absence after the opening doesn't hurt the story. Art by Riley Rossmo is over the top and really shows the insane and surreal nature of things, especially near the end, but also balances the feeling of seriousness and dread when it needs to be. The action especially is drawn with flow that is cartoony and over the top that would sometimes appear in some pulp comics, but still giving a sense of brutality. This is also helping by the color, which was done by Ivan Pasquinia. Even some things that you'd think would come off as silly end up working surprisingly well, like the Shadow's crazy long scarf. If I had any complaints on the art, it would be the Joker's design. It's not bad in most parts, but I was just not digging the purple t-shirt in place of his suit. I think they were trying to make him resemble a bit more like Jared Leto back when he was the Joker, but it just wasn't working. Luckily, the personality saves it. So yeah, that's Batman, the Shadow, the Murder Genesis. As you can tell, I think this story is great. Neither side takes full control of the story and feels like an equal partnership, and does a phenomenal job introducing one of comics' oldest heroes to new readers. If you want a crossover full of mystery, horror, and action around the Christmas season, this is a story for you.
Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe, and have a Merry Christmas. And be safe out there.
Merry Christmas. Alright, let's go. I don't want to be late to Krampus's party. You still haven't explained to me how you know both Santa and Krampus. I'll tell you later. Are you? Nope. Ugh. Come on, guys. Let's not fight. It's Christmas.